Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Ponderosa honey processed Panama from One Half Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And One Half, based out of Petaling, Jaya, Malaysia. And they were originally a suggestion to us by Oh Boy, Oh Boy, Oh Boy. So shout outs to and thank you to Oh Boy, Oh Boy, Oh Boy for the suggestion. This is One Half's second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed the La Papaya Mejorado, a wash processed Ecuadorian coffee. And this coffee caught my interest for two reasons, the first of which being that it is a honey processed coffee. And when trying out a coffee roaster for the first time, I usually like to review one of their washed and one of their non-washed offerings, with honey processed coffees kind of cheating the system, as they're technically not a wash processed coffee, but they don't require the commitment of reviewing a significantly more processed coffee. With the second reason being that this one is a Sidra, and I've also said in the past that I very much enjoy reviewing non-Gesha Panamanian coffees, and I haven't seen too many Panamanian Sidras out there, so it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as it's right here is day 44. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So this one did turn out a little bit more developed than the previous One Half coffee that we had reviewed. So I feel like a lot of people would align this one with being on the slightly lighter side of a medium, as it's not necessarily a true medium, either that or on the more developed side of that light medium, as a lot of the developed qualities were definitely present within this one. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 18, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the experience itself was very interesting, as it had a fair bit of the Sidra-like spiced quality to the base, with it being reminiscent of what I describe as being a generic coffee feel to it, and what a lot of people associate coffee with tasting. That's the best way I could describe the overall base of this coffee, as it seemed to have a pretty notable robustness to it. It did have a mostly clean experience with a mixed bag of different fruit qualities, mostly leaning in a citric tone, but overall it was just an okay first start, certainly not necessarily what I was expecting from this coffee. Day 21, through the Chemex, and the coffee itself does continue to remain slightly unusual, with more of the spiced qualities to the cup. Additionally, there are more citric qualities with a very unusual savoriness as well. Relatively clean, but okay again. And at this moment, I thought that that very unusual savoriness was just maybe a very out there sort of tea-like attribute to this one, but we'll get into that a lot more throughout this review, as on day 24, we opted for the April brewer, and the cup itself has increased in the overall spiced qualities, as it's pretty herbal and vegetal to this point, with it being by far the most dominant aspect of this coffee. A bit more intensity with a little more of the fruit sweetness, but an almost grassy quality that really seemed to dominate the cup. So it's at this moment I kind of took a step back and looked and assessed what this coffee was supposed to be. And for the most part, it sounded pretty normal, except for the final note that they had listed on here, which is, I believe, ylang ylang. And I really had to look up what that was, and it appears to be some sort of plant. And it's at that moment all of this made sense, because I was so perplexed why this coffee tasted the way it did. Initially, I chalked it up to it just being a Sidra coffee, but the more I continued to drink this one, the more out there that quality continued to be, as I've described it being as grassy and vegetal, but for the most part, I think the other descriptor I have would be kind of soapy in that regard too. So this very intense feel to this coffee that really seemed to dominate a lot of the characteristics on this one. Day 27, through the V60 with lower temperatures, and this was possibly the best it had been to this point, as it does have more of the spiced qualities being toned down relative to some of the earlier days. Still a bit of the generic coffee feel to the cup, with some slight tartness as well. So even with it being the best day of the experience we had had, it was still just okay. Day 30 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it was a little bit better than some of the previous days, as it feels like a much more traditional Central American coffee with a slight molasses-like feel to complement the very strong spiced citric and the spiced and citric tones. Improvement from previous days, even if it still isn't necessarily the best. day 33 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the cup does continue to skew heavily in the vegetal herbal tea sense, with the citra-like spiced qualities overly dominant at this point. And I really had no success with the V60. All of the cups we've tried with the V60 have continued to yield a lot of those results. So we did abandon the V60, and on day 36 we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it was slightly better than the V60 as it does have plenty of those vegetal herbal tea-like aspects with that strong citrus spiced quality. There are some slight citric qualities as well with it, continuing to offer that generic coffee feel. So it's been a perplexing one. It's been a very unusual experience, but on day 39 we went back to the Chemex one last time, and this was the best it had been towards the end, as it still had plenty of the vegetal qualities, but it felt slightly more tamed. I felt like the Chemex was somewhat stripping a lot of those extremely intense spiced qualities on this one. It is also marred by a slight bit of roastiness to it as well. A lingering bit of smokiness does muddle an otherwise citric base, so a lot of mixed results within the experiences we had drinking this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, and I've been trying to decide how I wanted to describe this tasting wheel. Depending on how you look at it, it kind of looks like a chicken logo for some sort of fast food restaurant. But yeah, this is a very unusual looking tasting wheel. Let's go through it. We have two level 5s. We'll start with the savoriness and the spiciness, both at a level 5. And I don't think that'll come as too much of a surprise, but I really wanted to demonstrate on this tasting wheel just how intense both those qualities were, mostly because it was so unusual relative to any other coffee that we've reviewed. We've had some really far out there coffees. Usually they're either processed or they have something else going on with them, but this one just being a honey processed coffee, it was just very strange that they skewed so heavily in that direction. I described them as being vegetal, earthy, grassy, in addition to that almost soapy at times. So that's where both of those qualities come in. That citrus spiced quality, very intense, very strong within this coffee. I think that's maybe the downside of it being a Panamanian coffee. I've always said that Panamanian coffees just seem to improve the overall characteristics of a lot of these varietals, and that seemed to be the case with this Sidra coffee. So that's what we're looking at there. So yeah, two strong level 5s, and then everything else but the saltiness is at a level 3. So we'll kind of speed run the important ones on this. The fruit qualities, it's mostly citric. It's mostly a little bit of that citric spiced tone to this one. So that's the best direction I can describe for the fruit qualities. Bitterness, level 3. Yeah, that kind of grassy quality does have a little bit of a bitterness to it. Body level 3, it has a fair bit of texture to it. Finish level 3, weirdly enough for it offering that very intense finish, it seems to dissipate somewhat quickly as well. Sweetness level 3, not even necessarily the sweetest coffee, nor is it necessarily the brightest coffee, as it doesn't really seem to offer a lot of the brighter citric attributes to go with that either. Florality level 3, and it seems to be a little bit more of a generic floral sense to it. I can't quite recall whether or not they had any sort of floral note listed on here. The notes I do remember, I think they had cranberry listed on here, and then they had that ylang, but towards the end, that's the only note that I really took note of, mostly because it seemed to just dominate the rest of the experiences within this coffee. So after those, let's discuss the two extremely important things within this tasting wheel, and that'll be the smokiness and the cleanliness. So outside of those very intense spiced vegetal qualities to it, there is a lot of the, we'll say, robust coffee feel to it. And once again, if I had to put 3 notes on this coffee, I would definitely say that it is, I guess, spice, grass, and then coffee, because those honestly were the 3 best things that, I guess I should say, the 3 most pronounced characteristics that I experienced with this coffee. And they were all notably abundant, and that's what really seems to hinder the overall cleanliness, because if I'm going for the cleanliness based off of the definition of this coffee, I mean, it is very well defined. That very strong spiced quality is very well pronounced, and you can feel it in a very notable sense. But once again, the overall experience of this coffee is marred by that smokier quality to it, which does seem to just hinder the overall experience, with, truth be told, isn't necessarily the most enjoyable for me going into it to begin with. So I'm kind of getting 2 fronts with this coffee that I'm not necessarily enjoying. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I think that's just kind of the best way I can discuss it. It is a pretty decent representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one's interesting. But what I really want to say about this coffee is I don't like citric coffees that much to begin with. So why on earth did I think that I would like a Panamanian Sidra coffee any more than I've liked the majority of other Sidra coffees that we've reviewed up to this point? It honestly just felt like it being a Panamanian coffee really seemed to accentuate a lot of those spiced tones to it. In addition to that, this coffee just skewed so far in a direction that I wasn't necessarily expecting, to the point where it was not necessarily what I wanted or was hoping for. It sounds very pleasant once again. When I purchased this coffee, there were a lot of fruit notes, and I'm like, okay, well, hopefully I'll be able to pick out a lot of these fruit notes, and hopefully the Sidra qualities of this one might be a little bit more toned down, because it isn't necessarily an Ecuadorian or a Colombian Sidra, but something like a Panamanian Sidra. But I was very wrong, which happens, and it's fine, and I think I paid the price because, yeah, I didn't necessarily enjoy this coffee that much. But that does kind of transition into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you really like that strong kind of vegetal earthy quality to your coffees, then I feel like this one was a very nice fit, while it's still offering a little bit more of a traditional profile, in the sense that it does taste like coffee, it does have some body, and it does have some robustness to it. I think that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Ponderosa honey processed Panama from 1/2 Coffee. Thank you for watching.